Let's review APUSH Unit 2. This is what we're going to be covering. So let's start off with some context. Britain had beef with some other powers, namely the French, Dutch, and the Spanish. They fought colonial wars and were trying to control the New World. The most important differences were that British colonies were more densely populated, the British had smaller trade networks, and they also didn't intermarry with the natives, unlike the other powers. Salutary neglect is super important because colonists are going to get used to self-rule, and this is very important later. Colonists are also want to expand into the Ohio River Valley, but it's French controlled. So both sides are going to start building forts and tensions are going to escalate. George Washington is sent with a militia to fight the French, which sparks the French and Indian War. The colonies initially get swept. To strengthen the war effort, the Albany Plan is developed by Benjamin Franklin. Basically, a bunch of representatives from 7 colonies meet up in Albany and New York to foster colonial unity. Before this, the colonies were independent. Another goal of this plan was to get the powerful Iroquois Confederacy on their side. Unfortunately, this plan is rejected because the colonies don't like working with each other. However, this does set the stage for future unity. William Pitt is a British statesman during the 7 Years' War, which is the French and Indian War in Europe, and he's going to start turning the war around, and the Iroquois Confederacy also allies with the British. So the French and Indian War is going to end with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. England is going to become the dominant colonial power by getting French land in Canada to Florida, and they're also going to take land in the Appalachians, and Spain gets some land west of the Mississippi. France is kicked out of the New World besides Haiti, and most importantly, salutary neglect ends, and the conflict therefore becomes inevitable. So 1763 is going to be a turning point for many reasons. Obviously, with the end of the French and Indian War, salutary neglect is going to end. England wants more control, but the colonists are used to self-rule, so the tensions are going to pick up. Moreover, England is broke after fighting so many wars, so they're just going to levy more taxes. Finally, there was Pontiac's Rebellion led by Pontiac and Audouin Chief. The natives are going to feel as if British colonists are going to start encroaching on their lands more than ever before, and they also lost French as a trading partner, so they're going to start a rebellion. Fighting breaks out and there's violence on the frontier again. The Paxton Boys are a group of vigilantes who try to stop this, but they just end up murdering innocent native lives. The British had to send more troops, spend more money to protect their colonies, so they end up passing the Proclamation Act of 1763. And this basically just prohibited colonists from expanding past the Appalachian Mountains, but the colonists felt that they were entitled to do so, and they hated this act. So after this entire fiasco, the British are going to think that colonists are incompetent and should pay for the wars that they caused, whereas the colonists think that they're very competent and wanted access to newly acquired lands. So England is broke, so King George and his Prime Minister George Grenville are going to want to tax colonies to finance the costly wars that they caused. And they're also going to want more power over the colonies. So here's some laws that England passed to control the colonies more. There's the Molasses Act, which attempted to raise revenue before the French and Indian War, but the colonists evaded this tax. And after the war, the Sugar Act was passed, and the Navigation Acts were more strictly enforced. In fact, there was a crackdown on smuggling, as smugglers would be tried in vice admiralty courts, where the judges were appointed by the crown. There was also the Quartering Act, which required colonists to provide housing and food for British soldiers stationed in the colonies. And the one tax that made the colonists absolutely livid was the Stamp Act. This taxed virtually every single piece of paper, affected the people directly, affected the middle class merchants and elites. Colonists were fed up with the previous taxes before, but this was the last straw. So colonists were absolutely furious with the Stamp Act. They didn't vote for these taxes, so they believed that these were unjust. Patrick Henry was influenced by Enlightenment ideas and issued the Virginia Resolves. These just argued no taxation without representation. England fights back by claiming virtual representation. Basically, because the colonists are technically British subjects, they're also technically represented by Parliament. Obviously, no one believes this. There's also the Stamp Act Congress, which was a group of representatives from 9 colonies to oppose British policies, showing more colonial unity. However, the colonies are still very disjointed at this point in time. Groups like the Sons of Liberty used tarring and feathering to attack royal officials. People also started non-importation agreements, which were boycotts of British goods. These were so effective that British merchants actually begged Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act because they were losing so much money. After all this, Parliament finally repeals the Stamp Act after an appeal made by Benjamin Franklin, who was a colonial diplomat, and lots of pressure from British merchants. However, Parliament also passes the Declaratory Act, which stated that colonies still had to submit to England. So immediately after this, Charles Townshend becomes the finance chancellor of England and passes the Townshend's Acts. These tax imports like tea, paper, and glass. This was just an indirect tax paid by merchants. The money raised would be used to pay royal officials who were previously paid by colonial assemblies. This meant that they would always vote in favor of England, not the colonies. Finally, a warrant was no longer needed. A writ of assistance could just be used instead. And obviously this made many colonists furious, and there was some sort of resistance, but not as much as the Stamp Act because it wasn't direct. So John Dickinson wrote letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania, which once again argued for no taxation without representation. England obviously argues for virtual representation. There's also lots of non-importation and non-consumption agreements, and groups like the Daughters of Liberty organized spinning bees to boycott British goods. And because there was so much resistance, England was actually losing money instead, so they repealed the Townshend Acts in 1770. Then in 1770, the Boston Massacre occurs when an angry mob of colonists provokes a group of British soldiers, leaving 5 colonists dead. Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native descent, is the first one killed. Paul Revere makes an engraving showing the British soldiers indiscriminately slaughtering colonists. Obviously this isn't true, but this spreads like wildfire and is used as anti-British propaganda. John Adams ends up defending the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre, which is highly controversial, but he did it because he believed in due process of law and equality before the law. And Samuel Adams, the second cousin of John Adams, creates the Committees of Correspondence in 1772 to keep up communication and resist British policies, another move towards colonial unity. However, there's no call for independence just yet. That is still too radical. So Parliament passes the Tea Act to bail out the British East India Company from bankruptcy and gives them a monopoly. Technically, smuggled tea was more expensive than legal tea, but it's not about the money, it's about sending a message. Colonists were once again furious and vehemently opposed the Tea Act. There's going to be no taxation without representation. So the Sons of Liberty dumped millions of dollars in today's money worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. Obviously, Parliament is understandably angry, but some colonists even oppose this and call this destruction of private property too radical. So in response, Parliament is going to pass the Corrosive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. This is going to close Boston Port until all the tea is paid for. It's going to ban the town hall meetings and also nerf the power of Massachusetts legislature into the ground. The Quartering Act is also expanded, with more troops being stationed in Massachusetts. And finally, royal officials will be tried in English courts and not colonial ones. And obviously, the colonists believe that these acts were intolerable, and hence the name. So in response, the colonists are going to pass the Suffolk Resolves, which had the colonists boycotting all British goods until the Intolerable Acts were repealed. So then the Quebec Act passed in 1774 had nothing to do with the colonists. It was meant to deal with French lands obtained in the French and Indian War. There's still French people just living there, and England just codifies what was already going on in those lands. So they're going to extend Quebec into the Ohio River Valley, establish a Catholicism as official religion, and also allow the government to not be democratic or have a jury system. And again, the colonists are going to get mad. They feel entitled to the lands in the Ohio River Valley. Protestants aren't happy either, and some were arguing about the slippery slope. If there's no representative assembly in Quebec or jury system, is England going to try doing the same thing here? So in response to rising tensions and especially the Intolerable Acts, all the colonies but Georgia are going to send representatives to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Again, everything important happens in Philadelphia. Most representatives like John Adams, Samuel Adams, and George Washington are elites, and they're going to disagree, but most want to make amends, not call for independence. They're going to send in their complaints like no taxation without representation to England in the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. They're also going to promote the Suffolk Resolves, create the association to coordinate boycotts, made military preparations, and also wanted to meet again in May of 1775. Again, this was a move towards colonial unity, but they still weren't united. Ultimately, King George III is going to reject all their complaints, declares Massachusetts as rebels, and sends in more troops to suppress the colonists. So the first conflict of the American Revolution actually happens a year before independence is even declared. British troops want to seize rebel gunpowder and arrest rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Paul Revere and William Dawes are going to warn the Minutemen, the militia of the colonists. And as British troops are marching towards the gunpowder stash, they are going to be ambushed at Lexington, where the shot heard all around the world is going to be fired. 8 colonists are ultimately killed. And then on the way back to Boston, British troops are going to be intercepted in Concord. The colonists actually stand their ground, and the revolution kicks off. So following Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress is going to meet. They're still divided over declaring independence or not. Most still think it's too radical. While negotiating, they're going to organize the Continental Army with George Washington at its head. And even while negotiating, they're going to fight the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British are going to end up winning, but they're going to suffer heavy losses, inspiring American confidence. So the Second Continental Congress is also going to send in the Olive Branch Petition, trying to prevent the war. And if you're wondering why they keep trying to negotiate, it's because they're deeply loyal to Britain, and the colonies are very disjointed, and rebellion is dangerous. Ultimately, this petition is going to be rejected. King George declares the colonies are in rebellion and hires German mercenaries. And even after this, independence is still unclear. So it's important to note that the Enlightenment heavily influences the American Revolution. So John Locke's and Rousseau's ideas of natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the social contract state that if a government wasn't willing to benefit its people, then the people were obligated to overthrow it. And the colonists obviously resonated with this idea. In fact, Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet argued with independence, which was still radical at this point, and this was meant for laymen, so it was very popular. And obviously, the arguments in here were no doubt based on Enlightenment ideas. So only after Henry Lee of Virginia issued a resolution to declare independence did the colonists finally do it. Thomas Jefferson is going to write the Declaration of Independence, the purpose of which was to justify reasons for rebellion. So they're going to send in complaints against King George III, and it's also important to note that a slavery passage was also taken out. They also want to unite the colonists for the war effort and get foreign aid, and obviously appeal to the idea of natural rights and popular sovereignty. So at this point, the colonists are still very, very divided. Patriots are only going to be like 30 to 40% of the population. They support a revolution, and they're most common in New England. The Loyalists made up 20 to 30% of the population, supported Britain, were educated, conservative, or wealthy, or had connections to the monarchy. And these people were treated as traitors after the American Revolution, causing many to leave the US after the war. Finally, most colonists are actually neutral. They're loyal to their state, but not really a unified America. So we're now going to go over British and colonial strengths and weaknesses. So the British were economically superior and militarily superior, but they were fighting an offensive war. The colonies are going to be familiar with the land, so they're going to use guerrilla warfare to take advantage. They're also going to be driven by a cause, as demonstrated by Washington at Valley Forge, where it was a tough winter, but the colonists stayed resilient. Finally, they also had support from France. As for weaknesses, the Continental Army was under-equipped and under-trained. The government was very weak under the Continental Congress and later the Articles of Confederation. And not to mention, many colonists weren't even sure if they supported independence or not. So why did France decide to help the colonists? So for one, they wanted to regain land lost in the 7 Years' War because that was just an absolute disaster for them. They also wanted to end British mercantile policy so they can finally start trading with the colonies. Finally, France was the center of the Enlightenment, and it made sense to support the ideologies of the American Revolution. So Benjamin Franklin is actually going to go to France to negotiate a formal treaty. France had been secretly giving aid before, but now it was official. So they're going to start sending in money, weapons, naval support, and troops. Now for some important battles of the American Revolution. We're going to start off with Lexington and Concord, where the shot heard all around the world kicks off the revolution. The Battle of Bunker Hill was a colonial loss, but it still was a morale boost because it showed that the colonists can stand their ground. The Battle of Trenton saw George Washington crossing the icy Delaware River to capture the Hessian mercenaries, which was a much needed victory after many, many losses. And the Battle of Princeton was also another small colonial victory, which was another morale boost. The Battle of Saratoga saw the British surrender, and after this, France officially joins the war. Now England is going to start focusing on the South because of the high loyalist and enslaved population. They think that taking the South is going to be easier. Finally, in the Battle of Yorktown, General Cornwallis is going to surrender to the colonists and the French, and this was the last major battle of the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris is going to ultimately end the American Revolution. England is now going to recognize American independence. The U.S. is going to extend its borders to the Mississippi River, to the Great Lakes, and the Spanish Florida. The Americans promised to treat the Loyalists with the same rights and respects, and all debts owed to British debtors must be paid. Now let's talk about some political impacts. So after the war, state constitutions are going to abolish old European laws like the granting of titles of nobility. Many states still had different views of republicanism. Some had property requirements, most only allowed white men to vote, and the colonial elite still ruled. However, there was this idea of a republican motherhood where children would be taught the values of a democracy to raise a new generation of patriots. And the American Revolution is also going to inspire revolutions such as the Haitian Revolution and the French Revolution. So now some social impacts. Women contributed significantly to the war effort. Even before the war, groups such as the Daughters of Liberty organized spinning bees to boycott British goods. Women maintained farms, businesses, or nurses and cooks to support the war effort. And then after the war, Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, said to him, "Remember the ladies," calling for more rights to be granted women. And there's also the Republican motherhood, as we talked about earlier. Unfortunately, women are still going to be treated as second-class citizens. So Native Americans often sided with the British because they encroached on native way of life less. However, some groups such as the Iroquois Confederacy were actually divided over this. As for African Americans, they were eventually allowed to fight in the Continental Army. The British also promised freedom to slaves that fought for them, such as the loyalist Lord Dunmore of Virginia. However, because the British lose, the slaves are not going to be free. Eventually, there is gradual emancipation after the war, as demonstrated by laws such as the Pennsylvania Gradual Emancipation Law. Basically, this law just stated that no more slaves can come into the state, and children born to enslaved parents are going to be free. However, slavery is still going to end up spreading, and each region is going to develop their own attitudes towards it. Slavery is also ultimately protected under the Constitution. So that's all for APUSH Unit 2 review. If you found this video of value, please consider supporting the channel. It's the best way to let me know that these videos actually help people. And thank you for your viewership.